The distant wail of a train whistle pierced the Montana afternoon as Grace Foster clutched the small leather-bound journal to her chest, her eyes fixed on the silent child beside her on the weathered bench outside Miles City's general store. 6-year-old Samuel hadn't spoken a single word since they buried his father, her brother, 3 months ago. The April sun cast long shadows across the dusty Main Street as she smoothed the boy's unruly brown hair, wondering if he would ever find his voice again. "It'll be all right, Samuel," Grace whispered, though the words felt hollow even to her own ears. At 26, she hadn't planned on becoming anyone's guardian, especially not in a town where she knew no one and owned nothing but the clothes in her trunk and the small inheritance that wouldn't last through winter. The stagecoach that had delivered them to Miles City, Montana Territory, in 1879 had long since departed, leaving them alone with their grief and uncertainty. Her brother James's letter had promised opportunity in this frontier town, but death had claimed him before they arrived. "Miss, are you waiting for someone?" Grace looked up to find a woman with kind eyes and flour-dusted hands standing before them. "No, madam, just gathering our thoughts," Grace replied, her voice betraying her exhaustion. The woman introduced herself as Martha Simmons, the baker's wife. "You look like you could use a warm meal. My husband and I have a room above the bakery we couldn't impose," Grace interjected, though her stomach tightened at the thought of food. "Nonsense. I recognize that look of someone new to town with nowhere to go. Come along." Grace hesitated only briefly before gathering their few belongings. Samuel followed without protest, his small hand cold in hers as they walked down the busy street. Martha's kindness extended to a simple but hearty meal and information about potential work in town. "The schoolhouse needs a teacher," she mentioned. "The last one left to get married back east." Hope flickered in Grace. With her education from Boston, teaching was one skill she possessed. "What about the boy?" Martha asked gently, watching Samuel push food around his plate without eating. "My nephew, he doesn't speak anymore. Not since his father, my brother, passed." Martha's eyes softened. "Poor little soul. Well, Miles City has a way of healing broken hearts, given time." That night, on a borrowed pallet in the Simmons' spare room, Grace held Samuel as he slept, whispering promises she wasn't sure she could keep. Tomorrow, she would seek out the school board and secure their future. They had no one else. Morning brought a crisp brightness that belied her anxiety as she dressed Samuel in his best shirt. "Be good today," she told him, though she knew he wouldn't cause trouble. Silence rarely did. The schoolhouse sat at the edge of town, a simple clapboard building with a bell tower that had seen better days. Inside, 3 stern-faced men introduced themselves as the school board, eyeing Grace with skepticism that dissolved somewhat when she produced her teaching credentials from Boston. "We've had 4 teachers in 3 years, Miss Foster," said Mr. Holloway, the most somber of the trio. "Frontier life isn't suitable for many Eastern women." Grace straightened her spine. "I assure you, gentlemen, I'm not easily deterred. My nephew and I need this position, and your children need education." After a tense interview and a demonstration of her knowledge, they reluctantly offered her the position with a small salary and lodging in the teacher's cabin behind the school, a one-room structure barely larger than a shed. "It's not much," apologized Mr. Ellis, the youngest board member. "It's enough," Grace replied, relief flooding her veins. "When do I start?" "Monday next. 22 students ages 5 to 16. That afternoon, Grace and Samuel inspected their new home. The cabin was dusty and sparse, containing only a narrow bed, a rickety table, 2 chairs, and a pot-bellied stove. "We'll make it home," she told Samuel, who wandered the small space without expression. Over the next few days, they settled into a routine. Grace cleaned the cabin and prepared lessons while Samuel sat quietly on the bench outside, watching life in Miles City unfold with vacant eyes. She worried about him constantly, especially when she would need to teach. Would he sit silently in the classroom? Would the other children be kind? Sunday evening, as dusk settled over the plains, Grace sat beside Samuel on their bench, reading aloud from a book of fairy tales. The street was quiet, most families at home preparing for the week ahead. The sound of hoofbeats drew her attention. A rider approached, his silhouette outlined against the setting sun. As he drew closer, Grace could see he was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair beneath his wide-brimmed hat. His clothes were trail-worn but clean, and the guitar strapped to his saddle marked him as something other than the typical cowhands she'd encountered. He slowed his horse and tipped his hat. "Evening, madam, young sir." Grace nodded politely but cautiously. "Good evening." "Forgive the intrusion, but would that be the schoolhouse behind you?" "It is. I'm the new teacher, Grace Foster." A smile transformed his face, revealing a warmth that reached his eyes. "Well now, that's fortunate. I was told in town the school might need some repairs before winter." He dismounted with fluid grace, leading his horse closer. "Flynn Quinn, at your service. I do carpentry work when I'm not with the cattle drives." Grace hesitated, studying him. His eyes were the color of the sky after a storm, and despite his rugged appearance, there was a gentleness to his manner that put her at ease. "The roof does leak," she admitted. "But I'm afraid the school board mentioned nothing about repairs, and I couldn't pay you myself." Flynn shook his head. "Don't worry about payment just yet. Mind if I take a look?" Against her better judgment, Grace found herself agreeing. Samuel watched with his usual silence as Flynn secured his horse and approached the schoolhouse. "And who might this young man be?" Flynn asked, crouching to Samuel's eye level. "My nephew, Samuel," Grace replied, then added quietly, "He doesn't speak." Flynn's expression showed no pity, only understanding. "That's all right. Some of the best listeners I know don't say much." He reached into his saddlebag and produced a small wooden flute. "I find music often speaks when words can't." He offered the instrument to Samuel, who to Grace's surprise took it carefully in his small hands. Flynn showed Samuel how to hold it, then played a simple tune on his own harmonica. "Music's a language all its own," he explained, more to Samuel than to Grace. "Sometimes easier than words." For the first time in months, Grace saw a flicker of interest in Samuel's eyes. As Flynn inspected the schoolhouse and cabin, pointing out repairs needed before winter, Grace found herself drawn to his practical knowledge and easy manner. He promised to return the next day with supplies to fix the roof and other issues. "The school board will have to approve any expenses," Grace warned. Flynn's smile was reassuring. "Let me worry about that. I've got credit at the lumber yard and away with reluctant board members." True to his word, Flynn returned the next day after school, his wagon loaded with lumber, tools, and supplies. Over the next week, he arrived each afternoon, working until dusk to repair the roof, fix broken windows, and reinforce sagging floors. Samuel, normally withdrawn, began to watch Flynn's work with interest. On the third day, Flynn brought a small piece of wood and showed Samuel how to sand it smooth. The boy worked at it diligently, his focus absolute. "He's good with his hands," Flynn observed to Grace as they sat on the bench watching Samuel with the wood. "Patient, too. He used to talk all the time," Grace said softly. "Always asking questions, telling stories. Then after James died, nothing," Flynn nodded thoughtfully. "Grief's a heavy burden, especially for little shoulders. Sometimes the heart needs to be still before it can speak again." Each day, Flynn would bring his guitar and play in the evenings after his work was done. Simple tunes at first, then songs with stories woven through them, tales of cattle drives and cowboys, mountain adventures and river journeys. Samuel began to sit closer during these impromptu concerts, his eyes following Flynn's fingers on the strings. One evening, Flynn taught Grace a simple song, her voice joining his in harmony that drifted across the schoolyard. She couldn't remember the last time she'd sung or laughed. "You have a beautiful voice, Miss Foster," Flynn said afterward, his eyes holding hers. "Grace, please," she corrected, a blush warming her cheeks. "And thank you. It's been a long time since I've had cause to use it for anything but teaching." As the days passed, Flynn became a fixture in their lives. He fixed the leaking roof, the sagging porch, the loose floorboards. He built shelves for Grace's books and a small bed for Samuel that fit perfectly in the corner of their cabin. The school board, initially skeptical of Flynn's involvement, relented when they saw the quality of his work and realized he was charging only for materials, not labor. "Why are you doing all this?" Grace asked one evening as they sat on the bench watching the sunset while Samuel practiced with his wooden flute. Flynn was quiet for a moment. "Everyone needs help sometimes," he finally said. "When I first came to Montana, I was little more than a boy myself. A rancher named Mackenzie took me in, taught me everything I know. Said the only payment he wanted was for me to pass it on someday." His gaze shifted to Samuel. "Besides, you two are good company." Grace learned that Flynn worked primarily for the Circle M Ranch outside town, but took odd carpentry jobs during the slower seasons. He'd been on the move since he was 16, orphaned by a fever that took his parents in Missouri. "The West has a way of collecting strays," he said with a self-deprecating smile. As May turned to June, Grace found herself looking forward to Flynn's visits, her heart quickening at the sound of his wagon approaching. Samuel, too, seemed to brighten in Flynn's presence. One Saturday, Flynn arrived with his wagon equipped for a picnic. "The wildflowers are blooming in the meadow by the creek," he explained. "Thought you two might enjoy a day away from town." The meadow was a riot of color: purple lupines, yellow balsam root, and blue forget-me-nots, creating a natural tapestry against the green grass. Samuel immediately began collecting flowers while Grace helped Flynn spread a blanket beneath a cottonwood tree. "This is beautiful," Grace said, taking in the snow-capped mountains in the distance. "I've been so focused on teaching and caring for Samuel that I've hardly noticed our surroundings." "That's why you need someone to remind you to look up now and then," Flynn replied, unpacking bread, cheese, and fresh berries from his basket. They spent the day by the creek, Flynn teaching Samuel to skip stones across the water's surface. The boy's face remained solemn, but his eyes held concentration and occasional flashes of pride when a stone skipped farther than before. As afternoon waned, Flynn brought out his guitar and began to play. The music floated across the meadow, mingling with the sound of the creek and birdsong. Grace closed her eyes, feeling the tension leave her body for the first time in months. When she opened them, she found Flynn watching her with an expression that made her breath catch. There was admiration there, certainly, but something deeper too, a longing that mirrored her own unacknowledged feelings. "There's a dance in town next weekend," he said as they packed up to leave. "For Independence Day, would you both like to attend as my guests?" Grace hesitated. She'd been keeping to herself since arriving in Miles City, focusing solely on Samuel and her teaching duties. "The whole town will be there," Flynn continued. "Might be good for Samuel to see other children outside of school and for you to meet more folks." "I don't have anything suitable to wear," she admitted. Flynn's smile was warm. "You'd look beautiful in sackcloth, Grace Foster." The compliment brought heat to her cheeks. "We'd be honored to join you," she said, ignoring the voice of caution in her mind. The week leading up to the dance was busy with end-of-term school activities. Grace's students had taken to her, and she felt a growing sense of accomplishment as they demonstrated their progress. Even Mr. Holloway grudgingly admitted she was doing well enough. Samuel continued his silence, but had begun participating more in classroom activities, especially when they involved music or drawing. Several times, Grace caught him almost smiling when the class sang together. The evening of the dance arrived with clear skies and mild air. Grace had splurged on fabric to make a simple blue dress, working late into several nights to finish it. She'd also fashioned a new shirt for Samuel from the remnants. As they dressed in their tiny cabin, Grace felt a flutter of nerves. It had been years since she'd attended a social event, not since before her parents died, and left her responsible for helping her brother raise Samuel. Flynn arrived promptly at 7, his wagon freshly painted and his clothes noticeably finer than his work attire. He wore a clean white shirt, dark vest, and his best Stetson, his dark hair neatly combed. The transformation in his appearance was striking, but it was his reaction to Grace that left her momentarily speechless. The admiration in his eyes as he beheld her in her new dress made her feel truly beautiful for the first time in years. "You look stunning," he said simply, offering his hand to help her into the wagon. The town hall was transformed with bunting and lanterns, packed with nearly every resident of Miles City. A small band played lively tunes while couples danced and children darted between groups of talking adults. Grace recognized many parents of her students, and to her surprise, they welcomed her warmly, thanking her for her dedication to their children. Several women who had been standoffish at church now invited her to join their sewing circle. "Told you they'd come around," Flynn murmured in her ear as they accepted cups of punch. "They just needed time to see your worth." Samuel stayed close to Grace's side, watching the festivities with wide eyes. Flynn had thoughtfully brought the wooden flute, which Samuel clutched like a talisman. "May I have this dance?" Flynn asked as the band struck up a waltz. Grace glanced at Samuel, uncertain. "Go on." Martha Simmons appeared beside them. "Samuel can sit with me and my grandchildren for a spell." To Grace's surprise, Samuel went willingly with Martha, settling onto a bench with two children near his age who were playing with carved wooden animals. Flynn led Grace to the dance floor, his hand warm at her waist. "I should warn you," he said with a grin, "I'm better with a hammer than with dancing." But his modesty proved unnecessary. He guided her smoothly through the waltz, their bodies finding natural harmony just as their voices had with music. Grace couldn't remember the last time she'd felt so light, so free from the burden of responsibility and grief. "Thank you," she said as they turned. "For what?" "For bringing music back into our lives. For making Samuel smile even if it's just with his eyes. For seeing me as more than just a caretaker or teacher." Flynn's gaze intensified. "I see all of you, Grace Foster, your strength, your kindness, your fears, and I'd like to keep seeing you if you'll allow it." The music ended, but they remained standing close, the world narrowing to just the space between them. The moment was broken by a commotion near the refreshment table. Samuel had accidentally knocked over the punch bowl. Grace hurried over, finding him trembling as several people dabbed at wet clothes. "It's all right," she soothed, kneeling beside him. "Accidents happen." But Samuel's face crumpled, and for one terrible moment, Grace thought he might finally break his silence with tears. Instead, Flynn appeared, crouching beside them. "Say, Samuel, I think this calls for some music, don't you?" He produced his harmonica and began to play a cheerful tune that gradually drew attention away from the spill. Samuel's shoulders relaxed as people smiled and began to clap along. Flynn winked at the boy and continued playing, transforming a potential disaster into entertainment. Later, as Flynn drove them home under a sky brilliant with stars, Grace marveled at how neatly he had averted Samuel's distress. "You have a gift," she said. "Just experience," Flynn replied. "My foreman has a daughter about Samuel's age, silent as stone since her mother died 2 years back. Music's the only thing that seems to reach her. Does she speak now? Not yet, but she laughs sometimes, and that's a start." When they reached the cabin, Flynn helped them down from the wagon. "I'm heading out tomorrow with the ranch hands," he said. "Taking cattle up to summer pasture. I'll be gone about 2 weeks." Grace felt an unexpected pang of disappointment. She'd grown accustomed to his daily presence, his steady support. "We'll miss you," she admitted. Flynn reached out, his fingers brushing hers briefly. "I'll miss you both too, more than I probably should." In the soft glow of the lantern light, his face was open, vulnerable. Grace realized with sudden clarity that Flynn Quinn had become essential to her happiness. "Be safe," she whispered. "Always am." He crouched down to Samuel's level. "Keep practicing that flute, young man. I want to hear how much you've improved when I get back." Samuel nodded solemnly, then did something that shocked Grace. He stepped forward and hugged Flynn around the neck. Flynn's surprise melted into tenderness as he gently returned the embrace. "I'll be back before you know it," he promised, his words meant for both of them. The 2 weeks of Flynn's absence stretched endlessly. School had ended for the summer, leaving Grace and Samuel with more free time than structure. Grace took a position helping at the general store 3 mornings a week to supplement her savings, while Samuel accompanied her, sitting on his now familiar bench outside. Each evening, they would sit on that same bench, Samuel practicing his flute while Grace mended or read aloud. Several times, Martha Simmons or other women from town brought food or stopped to chat, their previous reserve thawing into genuine friendliness. "That Quinn fellow certainly made an impression on you," Martha observed one evening as she delivered a fresh loaf of bread. "He's been very kind," Grace replied carefully. Martha's knowing smile spoke volumes. "Kindness is just the beginning, dear." "I've known Flynn Quinn for 3 years, and I've never seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you." Grace felt her cheeks warm. "We've only known each other a short while. Time isn't always the best measure. My Henry proposed after knowing me 6 days. We've been married 32 years now." Martha patted Grace's hand. "Just something to consider." The days passed slowly. Samuel continued his silence but showed other signs of healing. He began drawing detailed pictures: horses, the schoolhouse, and frequently, a man with a guitar who was unmistakably Flynn. On the morning marking 2 weeks since Flynn's departure, Grace and Samuel sat on their bench after returning from the general store. Samuel was attempting a new melody on his flute when the sound of approaching hoofbeats made them both look up. Flynn rode toward them, dusty and trail-worn but smiling broadly. Grace's heart leapt at the sight of him, and she had to restrain herself from rushing to meet him. Samuel had no such reservations. He jumped from the bench and ran toward Flynn, flute still clutched in his hand. Flynn dismounted and crouched to receive the boy's enthusiastic greeting. "Well, hello to you two," he laughed, ruffling Samuel's hair. "Did you miss me?" Samuel nodded vigorously, then stepped back and raised his flute. "You want to play for me?" Flynn asked. "I'd be honored." Grace watched as Samuel played the simple tune he'd been practicing, his small face intense with concentration. It wasn't perfect, notes wavered and timing faltered, but the boy's effort was unmistakable. When he finished, Flynn applauded. "That was excellent. You've been practicing hard." Samuel beamed, his face transformed by the first real smile Grace had seen since her brother's death. Flynn approached Grace, his eyes taking in every detail of her face as if memorizing it anew. "And how have you been, Miss Foster?" "Better now," she admitted softly. That evening, Flynn joined them for supper in their small cabin. He shared tales of the cattle drive, the beauty of the high mountain meadows, the challenge of crossing swollen streams, the camaraderie around campfires. "Did you ever want a different life?" Grace asked as they sat outside afterward, watching the stars appear while Samuel played contentedly nearby. "Something settled, permanent." Flynn was quiet for a moment. "When I was younger, I thought the open road was freedom. Now," he glanced at her, "I'm starting to see the appeal of putting down roots." The summer unfolded in a pattern of quiet joy. Flynn continued working at the Circle M Ranch, but spent most evenings and his days off with Grace and Samuel. He brought music, stories, and an easy companionship that filled the empty spaces in their lives. Together, they explored the area around Miles City, picnicking by the Yellowstone River, gathering wild berries in the foothills, attending community gatherings where Flynn's guitar and voice made him a welcome addition. Samuel remained silent but grew more expressive in other ways. He communicated through nods, gestures, and increasingly complex music on his flute. His eyes, once vacant with grief, now sparkled with curiosity and occasional mischief. As July turned to August, Grace realized that their lives had become irrevocably entwined with Flynn's. He had transformed their lonely existence into something rich and warm, bringing not just music but laughter and hope back into their world. One evening, as they sat on their bench watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, Flynn seemed unusually quiet. "Is something wrong?" Grace asked, noticing his thoughtful expression. Flynn took a deep breath. "I've been offered a permanent position at the Circle M. Foreman wants to retire next spring, and he's recommended me to take his place." "Flynn, that's wonderful," Grace exclaimed, genuinely pleased for him. "It would mean staying in one place," he continued, his eyes searching hers. "Building something lasting. Isn't that what you want?" "It is." He hesitated, then took her hand in his. "But not by myself." Grace's heart began to race as she understood his meaning. "I know it hasn't been long," Flynn said softly, "but I've never been more certain of anything in my life. I love you, Grace Foster. I love Samuel too. And if you'll have me, I want to build a life with both of you." Tears filled Grace's eyes as emotions she'd been holding at bay broke free. "Flynn," before she could continue, Samuel suddenly appeared before them. He tugged at Flynn's sleeve, his expression urgent. "What is it, buddy?" Flynn asked. To their astonishment, Samuel opened his mouth and spoke his first words in months. "Don't go," he said, his voice raspy from disuse. "Stay," Grace gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Flynn looked equally stunned. "Samuel," Grace whispered, hardly believing her ears. "Please stay," Samuel repeated, his small face earnest. "You make Aunt Grace happy, you make music, stay with us." Flynn gathered the boy into a hug, his eyes meeting Grace's over Samuel's head. They were bright with unshed tears. "I want nothing more," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But that's up to your aunt." Grace reached out, encompassing them both in her embrace. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Flynn Quinn, we want you to stay." Samuel wiggled between them, his face solemn but his eyes dancing. "Forever," Flynn laughed, the joy in his voice unmistakable. "Forever sounds just about right." They were married on a perfect September day, with the mountains wearing their first dusting of snow and the cottonwoods turning gold along the river. The entire town turned out for the celebration, the schoolyard transformed with flowers and ribbons. Samuel, dressed in his best clothes, proudly carried the rings and, to everyone's delight, clearly said, "I do," when the minister asked if he approved of giving his aunt to Flynn. The reception lasted well into the evening, with Flynn and his friends from the ranch providing music that had everyone dancing. Samuel joined in with his flute, his playing much improved under Flynn's patient tutelage. As dusk fell, Flynn took his guitar and led Grace to a quiet corner beneath the old oak tree. There, he sang a song he'd written just for her, a ballad of a lonely cowboy who found his heart when he least expected it, with a woman and child who taught him the meaning of home. "I never thought I'd find this," Grace said later as they stood on the porch of the ranch foreman's house, their new home, watching the stars emerge. "After James died, I thought our lives would be just survival, nothing more." Flynn's arms encircled her from behind, strong and secure. "And I never thought a broken-down schoolhouse roof would lead me to everything I never knew I wanted." He placed a gentle kiss on her neck. "Thank you for letting me stay." "Thank you for asking," she replied, turning in his embrace to meet his lips with hers. Inside, Samuel slept peacefully, the silence that had imprisoned him finally broken. On the table lay his flute beside Flynn's harmonica and guitar, instruments of the healing that had brought their family together. The years that followed brought challenges, as all lives do, but also immeasurable joy. The Circle M Ranch thrived under Flynn's management, and Grace continued teaching, eventually establishing Miles City's first proper library. Samuel's voice, once found, grew strong and confident. He showed a talent for both music and building, following in his adoptive father's footsteps while creating his own path. 2 years after their wedding, Grace gave birth to a son they named James, in honor of her brother. 3 years later, a daughter named Margaret completed their family. Their home rang with music, laughter, and the busy sounds of family life on summer evenings. They would often sit on the porch of their ranch house, watching the children play while Flynn strummed his guitar. Grace would remember that first bench outside the schoolhouse, where a silent child and a grieving woman had waited without hope until a cowboy with music in his soul showed them a different future. No regrets. Flynn would sometimes ask, even after decades together, his hair now streaked with silver but his eyes still bright with love. And Grace would always answer the same way, her heart full with the life they'd built. Only if you hadn't stayed. In 1929, 50 years after they first met, Flynn and Grace celebrated their golden anniversary surrounded by children, grandchildren, and the entire community of Miles City. Samuel, now a respected builder with his own family, presented them with a gift, a bench, lovingly crafted from the wood of the old schoolhouse, which had finally been replaced with a modern building. Carved into its back were simple words that told their story. She sat with a silent child. He brought music and stayed. As twilight settled over the Montana landscape they had come to love, Flynn took out his guitar, worn but still sweet-voiced, and played the song he had written for Grace so many years before. Their grandchildren gathered around, drawn as always to the music and the love it represented. In that moment, as in all the moments that made up their life together, Grace knew that true happiness wasn't found in grand gestures or perfect circumstances, but in the courage to open one's heart to possibility, to healing, and to love. Flynn's eyes met hers across the circle of their family, and the smile they shared held a lifetime of understanding. They had found in each other not just love, but home, that elusive place where music and laughter could heal even the deepest wounds, where silence gave way to song, and where stay became forever.